Mhm.
They go by pi the what? The US.
US. I thought you were the committee members go
Okay,
by.
please. I think we're gonna get started. I just started the recording, so just so you know, everything you say is gonna be recorded. And I have the very easy job right now of introducing Jonathan. I say easy because I think most of us already know him. Some as a student, some as a teacher, some as a colleague, advisee, mentor, and all of us a friend. So I think it's very easy. I think I'll say what I always say in PhD defense. It is a big day, and we're often bad at celebrating the way we should. It's importantly the product of the PhD is not the thesis; it's the new doctor. It's the person itself. It's the person you become through the process of a PhD. So it's the moment where baby scientists become grown-up scientists in some way. I'm stealing words from Juniper right now. And I think usually I like to highlight how the person has become a grown-up scientist and an expert, but I don't think I'm going to do that in the case of Jonathan. I think what's really amazing is that he has maintained a childlike approach to research. And I think that's a strength. It's not a strength for everyone, but I think it works for him. And it is, a good scientist, an excellent scientist, but driven by curiosity and play, and not just by the process of getting a PhD. And I think that's amazing. And so what you're about to see is a great PhD thesis. I think what's harder is to imagine how much curiosity and fun was behind the scene going into that thesis. And so hopefully we all get to celebrate once this is done, or at least I'll get to chat and appreciate all the fun that Jonathan has and all the curiosity that he has for the world. So I'm really excited for the work you're going to see, but also for the scientist you're about to see present his thesis. So Jonathan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Laurent. Thank you, everybody, for being here. So if you know me, you know I've become a little obsessed with groups during my thesis. So you might have heard me talk about why do they exist? What are they? How we measure them? Are they subject to natural selection? But one thing I come to realize during writing my thesis is that actually it's not really about groups. It's about how we shift the focus from individuals to groups, help us model the coevolution of individual and institutions. And I think that's a key point because for a lot of us, we've been trained in complex system and network science, and we've been trained to believe that interacting individual components can get you emergent group level behavior. And it's something that we take for granted. I think this view is necessary, but not necessarily sufficient to explain humans' unique ability to cooperate on large scale collective problems. So in this talk, I'll argue that it is useful to commit ourselves to an even stronger view of groups, that institutions are group level features that extend beyond simple group interactions, and that this view is best argued from an interdisciplinary perspective. So the goal for this talk is simple. What do I mean by coevolution of individual and institutions? Why do you care? And how do group-based models change our view of networks? And then I propose places that we can go next with that. This is a brook runs in Alaska. I didn't know that place. It's beautiful. But the winter temperature typically range from 0 to minus 45 degrees Celsius, or minus 49 Fahrenheit for you. The man at the front is Simon Pareak. He's born in 1900 near the Kittick River in the Brooks Range. He's been raised as a hunter, and he later collaborated extensively with scientists and eventually became a writer. To survive and thrive in the Brooks Range, the Inuit people relied extensively on caribou hunting, especially the inland one. So what you're seeing here is a drawing by Simon Paneak, depicting a traditional caribou drive with hunters guiding the herd into a corral, and it is now the gates of the Arctic National Park. So one method involved driving the caribous into a river and then hunting them from there. A single hunt could involve hundreds of people. They also used drive lines, long lines of rocks and wood to guide the herd. These structures are interesting to anthropologists because they function as a shared capital infrastructure. Basically, they are built and maintained collectively by the community. Those drive lines can length up to 50 kilometers. And don't forget, we are talking here about the Canadian Barrennlands, which means that the tree line from which we can collect the branches that are on the corner. To build and maintain those structures, the dynamic people had to collaborate together, find ways to solve large-scale collective action problems, such as communal hunting. In that sense, anthropologists said that humans are obligatory cooperators. We work as part of large groups, and we understand that more and more, for a long time, large group of unrelated people that is unprecedented in nature. How do we do that? So the Nunavut people arguably thrive because they scaled up their cooperative strategies to meet the demand of complex collective action problem. Just not the communal end. Think about stateless warfare, current warfare, managing contagion in industrial societies. In each case, humans create rules, norms, conventions when it comes to solve those challenges. So a key assumption of this thesis that's coming from cultural anthropology is that humans are able to create cumulative cultural practices and knowledge. Those set of cumulative cultural practices shape our biology, but we also offload them into our local environment through cultural niches. By creating a kind of second evolutionary system, we can compensate for some of our cognitive limit when it comes to altruistic behavior. Yet, institution did not send orbital stations into space either. We have a peculiar psychology that allows us to want things that institutional frameworks provide. One way to appreciate that is that cultural psychology is through comparative studies of chimpanzees and children. So in problem-solving tasks, it was assumed for a long time that children will simply outperform chimps in problem-solving tasks. But at comparable age, young children are not that much better than chimps at figuring things by themselves. They are particularly good, though, at learning from each other. Children, even at 8 months of age, they begin engaging in turn taking. They're going to look where you look, and then as we go on, it helps them being attuned with the social context. By age 3 or 4, they will absorb seemingly irrelevant details when shown how to solve a task. Later on, not only they internalize those details, but they're going to show concern for others to follow the same arbitrary rules, what you might think of culture in shared activities. And they will react with guilt and shame when those norms are violated. So networks have revolutionized our understanding of large-scale social structure. But arguably, they largely narrate a view of these individuals as mindless entities interacting in different space. Higher order networks and complex contagion improve on the individual aspect by recognizing that some dynamics are best expressed at the group level, beyond pairwise interactions, they say. But as far as I can tell, the concept of groups in this literature emerged from the math itself. Groups are defined by the presence of within-group nonlinear effects or something like that. Think of coauthorship or information broadcast, which is treated as qualitatively distinct from the sum of pairwise ties among the same individuals. This definition is convenient, but it doesn't really address what we've discussed so far. It neglects the broader institutional context in which group interactions are embedded. And as we saw, it is something that makes us uniquely human. So here, how I define co-evolutionary process in my thesis is really as models that capture the complexity emerging from the distinct yet entangled ontologies, for example, individuals and institutions evolving together. So I'm not the first to argue that we should study co-evolutionary process. But what is interest to me is how it's been represented. So in my thesis, I show how social network analysis, for example, has emphasized the structure of networks over that of group. Even though that, of course, the groups is assumed to mediate those networks. So we can think of affiliation network where individuals are linked with shared events, but yet the groups remain in the background. Institutions can be more directly modeled at the group level. So we're going to draw from other fields, such as collective action theory, where they make the case, and it's clear that what happens in one group, for example, is not just the within group dynamics, but it depends on other groups. And to capture such dependencies, it's not just the higher order structure mechanism, but we need to treat the groups themselves as coupled. interacting entities. Although we're going to draw from other fields to inform our thinking of groups, we're still going to adopt tools from complex systems to make our group-based approach more formally precise. I'll present a typology that distills key ideas from the social sciences into a few core dimensions. And I'll show how those map into familiar network modeling assumptions. This is the end result of my literature review, but here we're just going to start from the end. The main point is that most higher-order networks models, by focusing on higher within group dynamics, captured only a narrow slice of what groups can actually do. This typology is going to offer a helpful roadmap for anyone trying to model group behaviors more broadly. So conceptually, we identify the following dimensions. Ephemerality is probably something that you will be the most familiar with. Here, I'm going to understand it as the group dynamics which survive the reshuffling of network models or not, which will map to the annealed and quench assumptions in network science. The coupling that we already talked, which is basically how groups influence each other. And then we have irreducibility, which is always something that is hard to pin down as a concept. And it is a stronger commitment, but here we will simply define it as groups having independent state from that of individuals. We will show that it is actually a useful assumption to make to model institutional dynamics. And finally, misalignment. Simply put, do groups behave in ways that reflect the preference of their members? I think that with irreducibility, it is when we start obtaining like a stronger view of co-evolution of individuals and institutions. To show how to use this typology, we will look at two case studies, which are at the core of my thesis, two papers at the core of my thesis. All right, let's begin with our first case studies. Models in the science of science have traditionally focused on individuals. Think of citation metric, reward, career trajectory, and often on bibliometric studies. But science, like traditional societies, have norms, stories, and practices that can be modeled as the co-evolution of individuals and groups. In this case study, we will focus on the emergence of new skills within research groups, which we assume to be individually costly to learn, but are promoted at a group level. As such, it's going to be a case of persistent, isolated, reducible, and weakly misaligned in the sense that we're going to model a group pressure of groups wanting individuals to do something, and individuals might be reluctant of doing it. As a motivating example, and I come from the humanities, so it's dear to my heart, we're going to look at computer programming in the humanities. For most people in the humanities, programming is a pain to learn. You are on your own. You might think it's not for you. And ultimately, programming is a bit like English. It's easy to get started, but hard to get right. At the same time, there are external incentives today for groups to build computational expertise. For example, there might be new funding opportunities, or perhaps it might help you publish in high-profile venues. Arguably, it creates a tension where it is costly for people in humanities to learn programming, yet it is good for the group. For me, I think this tension is best exemplified by this second question here, where people at Simon Fraser ask if their work in digital humanities was highly cooperative or not. And then you have the faculty answering that it was highly cooperative, while the students thought that it was only minimally or moderately cooperative. So I like to think of programming in the humanities a bit like hysteresis in ecology. Hysteresis describes how small environmental changes can trigger large, often irreversible shift between alternative stable states, a bit like a forest tipping into a savanna due to a severe drought. Once the system crosses a threshold, returning to its original state becomes much more difficult. Ecologists, as myself with humanities, are interested in hysteresis for conservation reasons. By understanding tipping points, maybe it's going to be better, it's going to be easier to predict the resilience and coexistence of different ecosystems. All of this leads to the first question of that paper. How should students and institutions respond to a shifting methodological landscape, where acquiring new skills is costly, in part because maybe the learning environment is lagging behind? In this case, individuals must weigh the private cost of learning to code against the collective benefit to their group. This creates a familiar public goods dilemma. If everyone contributes, the group gains through a nonlinear synergistic effect. The benefit of learning to code here in this model is split into two parts. There's an individual benefit of doing it and a group level, both dependent on a fraction of programmer X in the group. The key parameters here, chi, is going to govern how quickly the benefit of learning to code saturate, what is referred as benefit cutoff. We're going to assume a diminishing return for the groups. Early programmers are going to offer an outsized value, while adding new programmers in your group just add less and less. In the same way, at the individual level, benefits are higher when few others are learning to code, but so is the cost, since there's no one to show you around. This cost in that case follows a logistic function that decreases as the group approach a critical mass xc, and the steepness of how fast the cost is decreasing is kc. This dynamic is going to create a temptation to defect, wait for others to learn first, and then benefit from their help. The baseline benefit is set by BL, and the R is controlling how fast the benefit decay. We combine these two into a transition rate here, tau, which governs how likely programmers are to start learning programming. This is modulated by bounded rationality, or how sensitive individuals are to the perceived payoff of learning code. We're going to embed our public good dynamics within a master equation shown in that schema. In this model, we're going to use Milo, our old lab mate, as our unit for programmers. Having many Milos in your groups lower the cost of learning to code. In blue, we have non-Milos. The master equation framework goes beyond averages. Instead of just tracking the average number of Milos and non-Milos, what we're going to do, we're going to model the full probability distribution over the different group configuration, also known as the occupation number. You can think of this as the fraction of system in a multiverse where it finds itself in a particular state, which it shaped the probability current that they call, that drive the transitions between those states. For example, you can track the probability of moving from there, no Milos, to a probability with 1 Milos and 1 non-programmers. The exact configuration in that model matters. A lone Milo in a group of non-programmers face different costs and benefit of learning to code than a non-programmers in a group of Milos, if that exists. Yeah. On the left is the master equation in math. In the bottom left, you see the same transition, which is here is going to be a probability. It's going to be the transition rate, where P over G is a fraction of programmer or Milos, which is weighted by the probability of success 1 minus of the cost function, and the number of people who are non-programmers available to make that transition. As a master equation, you can recognize that we have different terms because we need to balance the inflows and outflows of probability to make sure that our probability distribution is conserved. In the top left corner in green, you can see our recruitment process, which is a logistic again. The carrying capacity reflects how the growth of groups is limited by varying constraints, such as time and energy of principal investigators to mentor their students. Below in purple and red, we have people graduating from the system at some rate, new and UP, and non-programmers may also leave due to failed attempts of learning to code. We combine all these transitions into the time-dependent distribution G and P, which represent the time evolution of probability of being in a state with N non-programmers and P Milos. Okay, cool. What can this model do? So first, there's bimodality in our system. That's what we're looking, that we want to model a transition. The animation I'm about to show you is going to show you the evolution of the group configuration, where the horizontal axis is the number of programmers, and the vertical axis is the number of non-programmers. The heat map shows the log probability of each occupation number. We initialize the system in a Milo poor regime in the bottom left, and when there's not that many non-programmers, a high ratio of non-programmers to Milos. As the simulation runs, the distribution will shift toward the computational regime in the upper right. The bimodality is one result of having a persistent group structure. By virtue of not basically reshuffling and redrawing from our groups continuously, we are able to track exactly how our configuration are changing over time. Without it, having ephemeral groups, most likely it would end up washing out that bimodality. In the middle panel, you're going to see now the final fraction of programmers, and we're going to gradually increase the benefit cutoff chi, which remember its larger values correspond to more persistent benefits. As we increase chi, starting from the programming poor regime, which is the upsweep blue line, you can see at some point there's an acceleration in the programming updates in the system. We visualize the shift in bimodality here on the right, where we observe around a chi of 0.11 that basically there's a shift in how you get a lot of non-programmers to a state where you have a lot of programmers. What's interesting is then if you start in an environment with a lot of programmers, you can decrease the benefit of doing it so that you start with many Milos. And then we see the hallmark of what is called the irreversible hysteresis. We can gradually decrease the benefit without groups reverting to the previous state. Okay. Now, given that we have a computational transition in our system, should groups try to accelerate it, trying to capitalize on the critical mass of having programmers? Or maybe you prefer to slow it down, giving more time for individuals to adapt? That was the original question driving the paper. To answer that question, we will keep track of two metrics. The cumulative loss, which is the number of people leaving the system due to trying and failing to learn to code, and the half-life of the transition, which is simply defined as the expected time for half of the groups to make the transition into the computational regime. To define the computational regime, we use the smallest region around that mode that you saw in the upper right quadrant, and that's going to be the 80% around that mode. We played with those this threshold and didn't make such much difference. We find that faster half-life transition are associated with lower cumulative loss. So in other words, when the transition in the blue line takes longer, basically more individuals will try to make the transition in poor learning environment, resulting in high cost of learning to code, and then leading to eventually to higher cumulative loss. You can see both shapes. All right. So in the first case study, we explored how skills are costly to learn and can emerge in groups that promote them to varying degree. If a methodological transition is inevitable, we find it may be more effectively for groups to embrace it as a team. This raises a broader question for the debate on programming in the humanities. How do group dynamics and incentives shape the adoption of computational methods? And using our typology, we might think of different extensions here. How might coupling and adaptive group networks influence those dynamics? What happens if individuals, once they learn to code, and there's been a cost associated to it, they just decide to migrate in computational groups? All right. Now we're going to go back when I started my PhD. Really fun time. The COVID-19 pandemic. In this case study, we show a model of irreducible and coupled groups. Here, the misalignment dimension won't apply because we don't have an explicit mechanism for representing individual preference, which is kind of the base thing that you need to have a different preference between individuals and institutions. The pitch here is that during my PhD, I learned that contagious model help us understand the spread of undesirable stuff, viruses, misinformation, risky behavior. And the basic assumption is kind of simple. The more you get infected, as you get more infected people in your system, you end up with higher prevalence rate. In network science, we learn basically that the network structure might have something to do with the dynamics of the contagion, for example, when you have AVTL distribution and all that. But the story remains the same. But when you step back, you realize that something is missing. In the real world, as contagion takes off, we saw that institution hopefully will fight to spread the bad stuff from happening. And that feedback loop, surprisingly, is rarely built into our models. So today I want to revisit that assumption that individual interactions alone drive the contagion dynamics. But first, I just wanted to make the point that modeling institution is not necessarily more complex than not putting institutions in your model. Often when we have simple and complex model, we have something like that in mind. On the left, you have simpler models, pumping balls, midfield, and all that. On the right, we have Zelda-like models that I stole the analogy from Colin Bucky, a friend of Laurent. And I really like that analogy because it's telling you that it is a kind of video games, like agent-based model that have many degree of freedom encoded in sets of rules. And although they are super interesting and you can emerge interesting behavior, are very complex to analyze as well. We can add one axis, and that's basically what we've done with higher order networks, where here we have reducible group-based model focusing on within group interaction. But now what we can do is like bring at the forefront how we model contagion dynamics. So instead of tweaking the network structures to see how individuals adapt to a contagion, instead hold the network fixed and play with how the norms and institutional policies impact the spread. You might recall that guy dressed as a Green Reaper, giving interviews during the pandemic. He was in Florida when they decided to reopen the beach at the height of the pandemic. He wasn't probably involved in some sunbathing rituals. He was more likely motivated by the same sense of guilt and shame he once felt as a child when the rules of a game were broken. His presence signaled a concern for others and a call to uphold public health norms. So how would we model that kind of dynamics? One option would do an agent-based model, we just simulate everybody. But another one is going to be to focus on institutions and on group that represent the institution. And then in this paper, we're going to ask how institutions of varying strength, so we can think of masking, but also social distancing, can hinder contagion. And what is the impact of timescales and coupling between groups on the coevolution of contagions and institutions? Once again, we are back to our schema of master equation. This time around, as you move on the right, you get more infected person, as shown in red. It's going to happen at a certain rate that I indicate there. Note that this time around, the local infection rate is going to depend on the institutional level of groups, L. Then once you move on the left, you recover. In this version, we assume that our groups are coupled so that people can get infected across groups. Here, similar strategy than main field strategies like bouncing balls in simpler models. You just have people across groups randomly bouncing in each other in other groups. This is in contrast with our previous case study, where basically we had the equivalent of one big group. There was no extra programmers due to interaction outside of the group. It was just one big group with different configuration. So we didn't need to know anything about what was happening in other groups, like what is happening right now in Whiskey. We need to know what they're doing to know in Burlington how we're doing. Now, assume that groups can invest in policies of varying strength. Stronger institutions right now are just better at reducing transmission. For example, if Winooski or Burlington decide to enforce the mask mandate, well, it's going to lower the prevalence. This new dimension I presented with depth, and basically it's groups having weak policies at the front and stronger policies at the back. Now, groups are assumed to move proportionally to the relative fitness of their current level compared to how the people are doing with one level up or down at a rate that is given by eta, which is basically at what rate do they copy each other. Importantly, we're going to assume that groups do want to seek local control of the epidemic. and they draw from the success and failures of other groups. So we're back to our infinite number of groups, probability distribution G. Here, I drop the dependence on N because we're going to assume that groups are a fixed size. And then it's going to be what is the proportion or the fraction of groups that is in institutional level L and high. That's what we're tracking here in our system. So the goal here is to reproduce a diversity of real-world scenarios. We'll look at this 4x4 table showing the combination of fast institutions and eradication and endemicity. And for each plot, I'll basically show you what is the proportion of people infected and what is the institution strength of each system. And let me give you an example. In the first case here, when you have fast copying rate, in the case of eradication, they do great. They're able to bring down the pre-existing endemicity almost at zero. At the bottom here, you can see that basically you only needed institutions of level 1 and 2 to get that going. If you compare that to a second plot where we have a slower copying rate, now, and also I should note that basically the beta is a bit higher in those plots. So we have a stronger epidemic. Because of the original slowness of the institutions, we're going to have an initial large wave of cases. At some point, they'll wake up and do something, and then there's going to be dampening caused by policies taking some time to be effective. Once they work, they're going to relax a little bit, and so on. Because institutions are slow, they do not remove their policies all at once, creating kind of this dampening effect, but also making them good enough at the eradication endgame. Okay, now let's look at the endemicity scenario where we accept to live with a relatively high rate of people that are infectious. The interplay this time around is probably the worst case scenario. You have fast imitation and a stronger epidemic, which prevents strong institution to emerge. You can see at the bottom here. It is a worst case scenario because then basically the emerging epidemic become the highly endemic. If we compare that to a case where we have slow institutions in the context of endemicity, as before, here we have strong institutions, we can control an existing outbreak before partially relaxing. But now, note again the dampening effect, where basically institutions don't want to pay the high cost of maintaining strong institutions, so they're going to explore weaker policies, leading to a situation where basically prevalence rate stay relatively high. Similar to individuals, arguably, groups with weaker institutions take advantage of groups with stronger institutions by benefiting from lower prevalence without contributing to the effort required for implementing stronger policies. We call that institutional free riding. Here we show how the equilibrium prevalence on the y-axis changes as a function of transmission rate. The non-blurred lines here, it's the typical case that I showed before. As you increase beta, you can see that there's a monotonic increase of prevalence rate. Now, the blurred lines represent the equilibrium prevalence, but only when the same level. So for example, for level 1, what is the system if only level 1 existed? And same thing for strongest institutions. So basically, we have a world where we ask what is going to happen if only the weakest institutions compared to a scenario when they can copy stronger institutions. To investigate that question, we introduce that normalized metric at the bottom here, which is bounded by between -1 and 1. You can see that the negative value by virtue of having LTD, so how you're normally doing, if it's a bigger number or larger number than how you're doing when you're just by yourself, the negative value here is going to indicate that you benefit from having stronger institutions around you. As a matter of fact, we're going to just call that free riding. So you can see that level 1 for a low beta, basically, they're always going to be better off in the presence of group of higher level. In that sense, they free ride. On the other hand, a positive value of that delta L, that metric, indicates that groups with institutional level that are strongest are experiencing higher prevalence by suffering from the lack of effort from the groups of lower level. Okay. Now we get to that part where we refer to as the call for action. Forget a little bit the red curves and now focus on the dotted lines, which is going to vary at 2 copying rate. It is the global prevalence rate. So we saw earlier that for weak epidemic, basically faster institutions are doing better. Cool. We also saw that for slower institutions, they are doing better in endemic scenario. So here you can see that the global prevalence rate in the slow copying rate are on average a bit lower, and that's what I was trying with the skate with the marker, than the same average global average rate on the faster copying rate. Now we can compare these two global rates. And what we see is basically that in between this regime of fast eradication and endemicity, there's a regime where you increase the transmission rate, but that increased the need for institutions more than it increased the contagion. This ultimately results in a lower prevalence steady state. Another way to put it is that basically slower institutions in those cases are called upon to intervene, but only in those specific scenarios. Whereas faster institutions just keep exploring institutional actions on their own in all scenarios. Cool. So, including institutional dynamics, we can see that we alter the dynamics of classical models. Here, higher transmission rate leads to a smaller final outbreak size due to the call for action. Modeling the contagion from an individual perspective is just not enough. You need to represent how government, for example, or moderation team on Reddit, are they going to respond to the misinformation in the pandemic and make sure that they step up in a way that is coordinated to optimize how do we deal with contagion. But we can go even further here. And this is not our last step in our typology. Misalignment. The strongest sense of misalignment is how people perceive institutional policies. It matters as well. And what we're going to call collective intentionality, how do people behave based on shared assumptions about what others' expectations matters as well. So that's basically where we go next. I'm going to show you the sketch of what we've done so far, but it's a very exciting kind of world that we can go all explore after that. So using those two case studies, I hope to have shown that group-based modeling can shed new light on established contagion dynamics. First, we saw a model of research groups that go beyond teams as just sets of co-authors. Drawing insights from collective action theory, we have shown that if there's to be a methodological transition, it is better to make it fast so that it reduces the number of people left behind. And once it is set, it becomes self-reinforcing. Second, we have shown in the COVID-19, or like the coalition of institution and pandemic, we have shown a surprising phenomenology. For example, the call for action in institutional for writing arises when you start giving more agency or more irreducibility to institutions. The benefit of our typology is that basically now it is easy to envision where we can go next, extending beyond reducible group interactions. Now, of course, our typology is just one among many possible ones. For starter, we can recombine any of those dimensions to get known mechanism. For instance, the way that people are kind of forming, reshuffling, or stay put in their group you can think of it as between ephemerality and persistent. You can achieve some adaptive group structured system. From my literature view, it is clear for me that social differentiation should be there. It is not fully fleshed out in a model, so we just swept it under the rug. But it gives you an extra oomph of when people become differentiated. It can significantly shape group performance, for example, in corporate setting or organizational setting. Specialization is a key dimension of group behavior. It's found across nature, but in human, again, it's kind of a bit different. it interacts with other dimensions in non-trivial ways. So you might think, for example, of how our roles are kind of inherited from institutions, and that let institutions survive through their long lives. So being, for example, the Christian church, you become a priest because you want it, but it's there because the institutions were there in the first place. Also, we didn't fully talk about misalignment. So, but to me, it's really where the strong view of co-evolutionary dynamics really comes into play. So let's just, Ivy is not there, but let's just take a hot minute to look at it. So misalignment, in my view, is everywhere, but it does lack a clear formalism. It can be as simple as a school of fish, which is just a decentralized dynamics that generate group level benefits, for example, anti-predator shielding, that is going to align, and that's the definition of alignment, with the individual fitness. We can have weakly emergent misalignment, as with individually rational, rational individuals who vote in a consistent way, but the way that you aggregate those votes lead to irrational majorities. So here, the key takeaway is going to be that individuals in irreducible groups, which possess persistent states like norms or policies, people can have opinions about how the public goods are managed. And if they're perceived as strong, they might cooperate more, and vice versa. So in that sense, individuals have opinions about the perceived quality of public goods. In the same way, institutions have more agency in that they must balance the available resources and the cost to sustain a high institutional level. So here the map looked really worse than it is. The goal is just to show how we could do it, and it's just some tweaks from the previous model. And I didn't show the map, but here I just wanted to show because it can be as simple as, let's say, think about a function here, which is the perceived value of public goods by individuals. That is, basically, people are going to cooperate or defect based on peer behaviors, how people are doing around them, but also the institutional satisfaction. The function f here is going to capture the responsiveness to individuals, to institutional strength, a little bit like the bounded rationality in the first case study. Then on the institutional side, in orange, we assume that leveling up institution entails some cost and benefit. So it's fun because that model gives you this balance between how basically institution needs to find a way to manage resources and costs to be successful, but then they also need to manage how people are perceiving that management of public goods, which is not unlike our introductory case with the non-MIT people. The overall dynamic is pretty cool. It allows us to explore how individual and group level traits co-evolve based on alignment. So stay tuned for a future print. Speaking of which, let's circle back to the non-MIT people as we near the end. Here, the elder described the place of caribous in their lab. Caribou meat is our meat. Since I was born, I was raised with it. The skin was my clothes, the meat was my diet, and the broth was my drink. Without caribou meat, what would I eat? I really like this quote because it goes a long way to show how something as simple as hunting in humans is fundamentally cultural. The idea of caribou is our meat, binds together people beyond blood ties, helping them to solve large-scale collective action problems. When the elders say it is our meat, she refers to that impersonal we, that philosopher and developmental psychologist called collective intentionality. So I think to leave you here, intentionality matters more than you think. We shouldn't underestimate the importance of shared meaning, especially since models from the natural science tend to inherit a more physics-based perspective on individuals. Groups are not static entities, and neither are individuals. What people believe, their intentionality, matters when it comes to define the social ontology of groups. How people feel about public health departments, are the people expectations about where their peers are thinking when they mask, is, I think, the cutting edge of what we should be modeling. Yet, for me, it is unclear how. I've come to call this challenge the art problem of intentionality. I think in my thesis, we made good progress to get some of that, especially through irreducible misalignment. But it is clear that we still fall short of capturing this kind of qualitative intentionality thing. Still, I believe that the group-based approach is promising. And as we enter a new era, I think, of social polarization, it's going to be essential to better understand the coalition of individuals and institutions. Because really, only by enjoying both of these views equally can we hope to make meaningful change at scales larger than ourselves. Thank you for your attention. Feel good on time. So I want to say a few words to thank you all for being here. Thank the committee who took the time to come here. It's been a wild ride. There's been a lot of people that have really played a key role in everything you just saw. I want to thank collaborators of projects that could have been and that started. They still can. It's the Ben and Jerry's cemetery, if you didn't recognize it. There's a little cemetery where you have like basically like the time of their the time that there was such ice cream. I don't know. Sorry. There's one last slide. I just didn't want them to see it. I mean, for the last 4 years, it's been crazy. Thanks. We've been, they've been, Junie and Laurent have been very welcoming. I thought that Laurent usually is always dressing up underdressing, but then for some reason I wanted to show a picture that he's overdressing, but he's actually dressed like that today. Yeah, it's like yeah, I wasn't aware. Huh?
I thought that was the photo that Don took at the start of your presentation.
Yeah, you just like. And also for all of you who are doing their PhD, groups is important, but some triads matter. So the best thesis is one whose writing was constantly interrupted. Yeah. Yeah. Reference. I can leave.
Just to remind everyone of the rules, we're currently recorded. So think about this before you ask any questions. And for those who haven't been part of the UVM committee thesis defense before, I want to just summarize the rule. We're going to have a public Q&A, and then I'm going to invite you all to leave, and we'll be able, the committee, to ask Jonathan to actually defend himself in the private portion of the Q&A. So I do want to thank, before we all have to ask you to leave, I do want to thank the committee members for joining. So we have Professors Peter Dodd and Juniper Lovato from the Computer Science Department, and we're lucky to have Professor Brian Beckett as chair for the committee. And so I now open the floor to everyone. It's the public portion before I ask you all to leave. So burning questions first. Folks online, I know we have about almost 10 people online now. Feel free to raise your hand or use the chat, and I'll try and monitor as best as I can. Any questions for Jonathan? The question.
Thank you.
Information and biostructure being fungible versus grounding. It's really relevant to your. So we talk about it.
I think, yeah, you'll need to remember like the fungible aspect of it. What do you mean?
Like, so if line on the board, if I say that versus Izzy says it, it means basically the same thing either way.
Yeah.
But if you say, it was very important to me that my baby interrupted my thesis writing. Like the meaning of that changes a lot depending on who's actually saying, doing the speaking in that scenario. There's sort of like, so that's the fungibility aspect. And especially when you're talking about like the intentionality and then the like sort of inclusion of like social structure, I think it's relevant to that.
So it's if I understand you right, it's a bit like, so intentionality is this thing that we got to experience and that we think that we experience, and then there's some aspect of it that is deeply rooted in some context that is both like the social and the semantic aspect of it.
Yeah, well, so the intention.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this is another sort of meaning that can either sort of refer to something that's going to transfer easily across
Yeah.
things or not.
So yeah, so for example, that last sentence where the best thesis is those whose writing was constantly interrupted. It's one thesis that I think PhD know what I'm referring to, right? It's like one is like the best thesis is one that is done, or also that from the context you understand that I was constantly. I mean, is the question will be like how we represent that if we were to measure it, or right. So I think the fact if we go back to that idea that as group here we have like a shared experience, writing a PhD thesis is one of those. It's something that is hard to communicate sometimes with our own families, right? It's not something that maybe they won't get the joke as much. So here the group I think is where the irreducibility kind of part of it plays in, where if you wanted to model who's part of that group, it's like where the stories or the meaning kind of sink in the most, which is not necessarily going to be the one that people, I hang out with some of you sometime, but definitely we know that we have like this shared thing that explain like why you're going to laugh at it or not. So I guess that the group-based approach of why we are a group is like basically you understood that joke, I guess. Um, yeah, that's I don't know. I think it's a very hard kind of intentionality. I spoke about it because I've been thinking a lot about it, but it's still for me like a very hard question to ever where even we get started with that question, because basically it's like if the question is like the philosophy of it, we can talk for a long time, and there's a lot of people who have things to say about it. I think if we wanted like to have like do computational linguistic about how you detect group based on that, I have some hidden insights on that, but it would be very challenging because we don't have like this mind reader of when people really gets it or not. It's like when you really feel seen in some ways. It's like this judge, like you know it when you see it or something, which is not something that we're there yet. Yeah. I mean, I'm begging for it. Mm, yeah.
I really like that.
Yeah.
And especially about the fuzziness of like belonging to a group.
Yeah.
Because a group is not so.
Yeah.
A lot of the time we like say, oh, I'm a Democrat because I believe that I like all the people that describe themselves as Democrat, but the group Democrat, I have no idea what it is.
Yeah.
Right? It's like, how can we define that when like, because a lot of social groups are like don't have a definition of what the group actually is.
Yeah.
So like a member maybe doesn't know that it's part of the group.
So I think something I talk in the thesis and it didn't show at all is like I'm using unions in the same way. And when you drill down into unions, there's collective action problems if you go all the way down. You have like a local unions. We need to deal with some very concrete problem about how to motivate people to become members and how to motivate people to join the unions and fight together against something. and it's a very communal hunting, right? You need to maintain a lot of social bond to do that. But once you need to fight the government, local unions, like tribes, are going to aggregate, coalesce into like clans, basically. And as such, you kind of inherit it through this nestedness of groups. But for me, it's still like, how do you model these kind of, yeah, once you're right, I think it's like very much groups, some definition of groups, and there's different, I do a kind of typology, some definition of groups, you are, and that's like that in collective action problems. It's like, who can help maintain those structure? And this is something that is dynamical. It's like, who get to participate to collective action problems? It's one way that you define groups. And the way that we model it is like, some groups are able to scale up and have stronger policies about what their group members should do. And in that case, it becomes way more binding as a group membership. Especially like once upon a time, groups were able to just kick out people and people are gonna die. So there's might have been like basically a stressing was like a death sentence. And today, if you're kicked out of your forum on Reddit, it's not the end of the world, but you can see that teams of moderator, if they want to have stronger and stronger action, they can impose stronger policies, but then you might have harder time for individuals to recognize themselves in what the institution or the bigger group is becoming. And then that creates this kind of co-evolution that I'm talking about. So in that process, it's like kind of defining a little bit the membership part. I don't know.
This and you sort of these separate groupings. I was wondering if there is any sense of like this whole kind of field of sort of like layering membership, sort of not just informal, the same grouping, but kind of looking at political affiliation, layered of religious affiliation, and then sort of modeling the dynamic of like layered of groups where they're not actually talking about the same types of groupings, it's sort of separate groupings where you could belong and not belong to many different groups.
Yeah, so higher order networks, it's all like Laurent's group early on, like when you motivated higher order groups, was basically based on mixed different membership, where how many people are belonging to different groups. And I think, thanks for the question. I think I wanted to clarify something because it can be, basically can be finicky with the schema, is that in one sense, what I call resistible groups is the people, we're in the same room right now. If someone is sick with COVID, there's a good chance that we just all gets it because we're like in the same room, in the same place. When I show those pictures and I think about irresistible group is like, who is under the charge of the public health department of Burlington? So it's already more diffuse, right? So it's like, we'll get to mask because Burlington said that you need to mask versus like Winooski. We don't need to be in the same room to see the effect of that. We're just under the same authority, basically. And that's where you have like this kind of resistibility and irresistibility, which again, if I were in a room full of philosophers right now, probably like some will jump at my neck. But resistible is really like what is happening in like one interaction of as a group is really what I mean. And that's what higher order networks focus them more. If you take a step back, this diagram is only meant to say like, if your group Burlington or like UVM kind of impose a mask mandate or just a stay at home, we don't open the university anymore, how is going to change the local infection rate, which is again, I think mixed membership and all that, it's been well studied in higher interactions. And what you're thinking the layered of interaction is one like multi-layer networks are trying to do that, like how the different social networks layered, kind of capturing that.
We're exactly at the hour. I'm not telling you all to stop asking questions, but I'm just saying that we did great. We're exactly at the hour. So if it's okay with you all, I will ask everyone but members of the committee and Jonathan to leave before the defend, and I will stop the recording.
I'm gonna keep the baby.
Thank you all. I'm sorry. Because of the, let's thank Jonathan.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, all good work should produce graveyards of ideas, so you should have. Many ideas will have unlocked for you.